No one noticed Caleb Monroe when he walked through the crowded halls of Eastwood Middle School. He wasn't loud, he wasn't disruptive, and he certainly wasn't one of the popular kids. Caleb was the kind of student who could sit in the same classroom for months without anyone learning his name. He was used to it. Every morning, Caleb slipped quietly into his usual seat by the window. He never tried to grab attention, never interrupted the teacher, and never spoke, unless called on, which almost never happened. He kept his head down, focused on his schoolwork, and tried his best to blend in. For Caleb, it was easier that way. Being invisible meant avoiding trouble. But the silence wasn't just about keeping a low profile. Caleb had learned long ago that speaking up often led nowhere. Teachers like Miss Roberts, the stern, no-nonsense history teacher, had a way of looking through him as if he wasn't even there. It didn't matter how well he answered questions, or how hard he worked. If there was praise to be given, it went to someone else. Usually, it was one of the right kid students like Ethan Parker, the golden boy of Eastwood Middle. Ethan was everything Caleb wasn't: loud, confident, and effortlessly popular. If Ethan answered a question wrong, Miss Roberts would chuckle, pat him on the back, and say, "Good try, Ethan, you'll get it next time." But if Caleb missed a question, there was no smile, no encouraging words, just a cold, heavy silence that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. And Caleb knew exactly why. It wasn't because he was a bad student, far from it. Caleb excelled in his classes, often finishing assignments faster than anyone else. But there was one undeniable truth he couldn't escape. He didn't belong, at least not in the eyes of certain teachers like Miss Roberts. Caleb was one of the few black students in a school where most of his classmates came from wealthy families. His clothes weren't new, his backpack was worn, and his sneakers had seen better days. Caleb didn't mind these things until he realized that to some people, those small details seemed to say everything about him. So he stayed quiet. He did his work, kept to himself, and let them forget he was even there. But what Caleb couldn't ignore, the part that gnawed at him every single day, was that they weren't just ignoring him. They were waiting for him to fail. It was in their eyes whenever he was called on unexpectedly. It was in their whispers when he made a mistake. It was in the way Miss Roberts barely concealed her satisfaction whenever he stumbled. Caleb knew they were waiting for the moment he'd slip, for the moment they could say, "See? He's not as smart as he thinks he is." He knew the game they were playing. But what they didn't know was that Caleb was playing his own game, a quiet, patient one. He refused to give them the satisfaction they craved. He kept his head down, kept his answers sharp, and worked harder than anyone else in that room. Still, no matter how hard he tried, Caleb knew they didn't believe in him. They didn't think he could be special. And that's what hurt the most. But everything was about to change. Because soon enough, Miss Roberts would set a trap, a carefully planned scheme designed to humiliate him in front of the entire class. And Caleb knew that when the moment came, they'd all be watching, waiting for him to fail. But Caleb had no intention of giving them what they wanted. For weeks, Caleb Monroe had been a shadow in Miss Roberts' history class, silent, unnoticed, and forgotten. But that all changed one morning when her sharp voice cut through the classroom. "Caleb, why don't you answer this one?" The room fell uncomfortably quiet. Heads turned. Some students shot confused glances at each other, not because the question was difficult, but because Caleb never got called on. Miss Roberts didn't ask him because she believed he had the answer. She asked him because she expected him to fail. Caleb knew it. He felt it in the smug smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. But Caleb didn't fail. He answered the question, flawlessly. His voice was calm, steady, and confident. Miss Roberts's smile faltered, her brow creasing ever so slightly. Not bad," she muttered, turning back to her lesson. No praise, no acknowledgement, just a cold dismissal, as if his success was nothing more than luck. But Caleb knew better. Something had shifted in that moment. And he was right. The next day, Miss Roberts' eyes lingered on Caleb longer than usual. She was thinking, calculating. And when her gaze sharpened, Caleb knew something was coming. It wasn't long before she struck. "Class," she announced a few days later, her tone unusually sweet, "tomorrow, we'll have a special performance. Caleb, I understand your grandfather was quite the musician. Why don't you play something for us?" Caleb's blood ran cold. The class erupted in whispers. Some students looked amused. Others seemed genuinely curious. But Caleb knew better. This wasn't a kind gesture. It was a trap. He glanced at Miss Roberts, her smug smile fully formed now. She was daring him to refuse. If he declined, she'd spin it against him, call him timid, claim he had no talent. If he agreed, she was counting on him to fail. So, can you play the piano? The voice came from across the room, Ethan Parker. His grin stretched wide, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Yeah, added Travis, one of Ethan's sidekicks. What are you gonna play? Chopsticks. Laughter rippled through the room. Caleb's heart pounded. He knew what they wanted, to see him humiliate himself in front of everyone. But if he refused, he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. All right, Caleb said coolly. I'll play. The whispers turned louder, students exchanging wide-eyed glances. Tyler, the only classmate who ever treated Caleb with real kindness, leaned closer. Are you sure about this? He muttered. They're setting you up. I know, Caleb said quietly. But they're not going to win. That night, Caleb couldn't sit still. He paced the living room, staring at his grandfather's old piano, a scratched, faded instrument that had seen better days. His grandfather, Raymond Monroe, had been a jazz musician, not famous, but respected. Caleb had spent countless evenings sitting beside him, watching those weathered hands dance across the keys. His grandfather had taught him everything, not just how to play, but how to feel the music. Music isn't just sound, Raymond had once told him. It's a language. Every note is a word, every melody a story. Caleb still remembered those words. But now, those memories felt distant, almost impossible to reach. It had been months since he'd played seriously. What if his fingers stumbled? What if he forgot the notes? What if they were right about him all along? His mother's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Something's bothering you. Caleb turned. His mother stood in the doorway, her eyes soft but serious. I have to play the piano at school tomorrow, Caleb said quietly. His mother's expression hardened. She knew what that meant. Miss Roberts? Caleb nodded. She's not asking because she thinks you're talented, his mother warned. She's doing this because she wants to see you fail. I know, Caleb replied, but I can't let her win. His mother crossed the room and knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. You've always been stronger than they know, she said. And you don't have to prove anything to anyone. But Caleb shook his head. I'm not doing it for them, he said softly. I'm doing it for me. His mother didn't say anything more. She just kissed his forehead, whispered I'm proud of you, and left the room. Caleb sat at the piano for hours that night. He played scales until his fingers ached, traced over familiar melodies until he could close his eyes and still see the notes. He knew tomorrow wasn't just about music. It was about proving something deeper. They were waiting for him to stumble, to confirm what they had always believed, that Caleb Monroe didn't belong. But he wouldn't let them win. He'd tell a story, his story, one they would never forget. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. Caleb Monroe sat at his grandfather's piano, the dim glow of a lamp casting a warm light across the room. His fingers hovered above the keys, motionless. He knew what tomorrow meant. It wasn't just a performance, it was a test. Miss Roberts had set a trap, and the whole class was eagerly waiting to watch him fall into it. They didn't think he could do it. They believed he'd freeze, stumble, or make a fool of himself. But Caleb wasn't going to let that happen. He closed his eyes, drawing in a slow breath. His mind drifted back to the memories, those long afternoons spent beside his grandfather, Raymond Monroe. The man's deep voice still echoed in Caleb's mind. Music isn't just sound, Raymond had said one summer evening as they sat side by side at the piano. It's a story. When words aren't enough, music speaks for you. Caleb remembered being no older than 6, his legs barely able to reach the pedals. He'd watched his grandfather's fingers dance effortlessly across the keys, each note carrying a purpose, a meaning. Caleb had tried to mimic him, but his fingers were clumsy back then, fumbling over the notes. Raymond had only laughed. You're trying too hard to be perfect, he'd said. Music isn't perfect, it's honest. Don't think about playing it right. Think about what you're trying to say. That lesson had stuck with Caleb. Over the years, whenever life felt too heavy, Whenever the world seemed too cruel, he'd sit at that piano and let his fingers tell his story. And in those moments, his grandfather's presence felt closer than ever. But after Raymond passed away, Caleb stopped playing as often. The piano, once a source of comfort, became a painful reminder of what he'd lost. Now, as Caleb sat in front of those keys once more, memories flooded back. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice, calm, steady, reassuring. "Play from here," Raymond's voice whispered in his mind, tapping his chest. "Not from here." Caleb tapped his forehead with a faint smile. Taking a breath, Caleb let his fingers drift down to the keys. The first notes were soft, hesitant. But soon, the melody began to take shape. His grandfather's signature blues tune, rich with emotion, began to fill the room. Caleb remembered the story behind the song. His grandfather had written it after losing his best friend, a tune filled with longing, heartache, and resilience. The melody wove through sorrow and hope, rising and falling like the waves of a storm. Caleb's fingers moved instinctively, tracing the path he had played so many times before. But this time it was different. This time, he wasn't playing for comfort or peace. He was playing to prove something, not to Miss Roberts, not to the classmates who mocked him, but to himself. He played for the boy they had ignored, the boy they had underestimated, the boy they thought couldn't succeed. He played for the boy who had spent years swallowing his frustration, quietly enduring the whispers, the smirks, the dismissive glances. He played for the boy they never believed could be extraordinary. Hours passed as Caleb practiced. His fingers moved relentlessly across the keys, faster, slower, softer, stronger, until the melody was no longer just a song. It was a statement. It was his voice. When Caleb finally stopped, his fingers trembled from exhaustion. The room was silent once again, but this time, it was a satisfying silence, the kind that follows a battle well fought. He sat there for a moment, staring at the piano, feeling strangely calm. That's when he heard footsteps behind him. His mother stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. She hadn't said anything during the hours he had played, but now her eyes held something he hadn't seen in a long time: pride. "You played like your grandfather," she said softly. "Maybe even better." Caleb shook his head. "I'm not sure I can do it tomorrow." "Yes, you can," she said firmly. "You don't need to impress anyone. Just play the way your grandfather taught you. From here." She tapped her chest, right over her heart. Caleb swallowed hard, nodding. That night, Caleb lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His fingers still tingled from the hours of practice, but his mind refused to rest. He imagined the classroom, the piano in the corner, forgotten and dusty. He pictured Ethan Parker and Travis in the back, grinning, waiting for him to stumble. He saw Miss Roberts standing near the chalkboard, her smug smile daring him to fail. But then he imagined something else, something stronger. He pictured his grandfather, sitting beside him at the piano once again, guiding his hands, smiling with quiet pride. "Play from here." Caleb closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "I will." The next morning, when he walked into school, Caleb didn't feel afraid. The nerves were still there, but they no longer controlled him. He had practiced. He was prepared. And he knew that whatever happened, when he placed his fingers on those keys, he wouldn't be playing for them. He'd be playing for himself. The morning air felt colder than usual as Caleb Monroe stepped off the school bus. His backpack felt heavier, his footsteps slower. Every sound, the shuffle of sneakers on pavement, the distant chatter of students, seemed muffled under the weight of what lay ahead. Today was the day. He walked down the hallway, head low, feeling the stairs crawl across his back. Word had spread fast. Students whispered behind cupped hands, some glancing at him with thinly veiled amusement. Others simply smirked, as if the outcome was already decided. Near the classroom door, Caleb spotted Ethan Parker leaning casually against the wall, grinning like a predator waiting for his prey. Travis stood beside him, whispering something that made both boys chuckle. "Better warm up those fingers, Monroe," Ethan sneered. "Wouldn't want you to freeze up in front of the whole class." Caleb didn't answer. He just kept walking. Inside the classroom, students were already seated. The room, usually buzzing with noise before class, was unusually quiet. Conversations were low, eyes flicking back and forth, all waiting for the main event. The piano sat in the far corner, an old upright model with faded keys and scuffed wood. It looked as forgotten as Caleb had felt all year. Dust clung to the edges, and one of the pedals looked bent, barely hanging on. Miss Roberts stood by her desk, a faint smirk playing at the corners of her lips. She didn't need to say a word, her eyes said it all. "I've got you right where I want you." "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice a little too cheerful. "Before we begin today's lesson, we have something special planned. Caleb Monroe has graciously agreed to perform for us." The sarcasm wasn't subtle. A few students snickered. "You ready, Caleb?" Miss Roberts asked, her smile sharp like a blade. Caleb swallowed hard. His legs felt like they were made of stone, but somehow, he pushed himself out of his seat. The room seemed to shrink as he walked toward the piano. Every step felt like a countdown. By the time he reached the instrument, the air felt heavy, like everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for him to fail. Caleb placed his fingers on the keys. They felt cold and unfamiliar. "You got this," he whispered to himself, barely loud enough to hear. From the back of the room, Ethan's voice broke the silence. "Hey, Monroe," he called out. "Try not to break a key." More laughter followed. Caleb closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He wasn't here for them. He wasn't playing for Miss Roberts. He wasn't playing for Ethan or Travis or anyone else who wanted to see him fall. He was playing for himself. For his grandfather. For all the times he had felt invisible. He exhaled slowly, and then, he began to play. The first notes were soft, delicate, almost fragile. For a second, Caleb worried he'd started too quietly, that the class would start laughing before he could build momentum. But then, something shifted. The melody grew stronger, each note weaving into the next like a thread through fabric. His fingers glided across the keys, not with hesitation, but with purpose. The soft blues tune his grandfather had taught him rose steadily, filling the room. The giggles stopped, the whispers faded, and suddenly the entire room fell silent. Caleb's hands danced across the keys, each note unfolding like a forgotten story. The melody carried the weight of memories, the warmth of summer afternoons spent beside his grandfather, the bittersweet ache of loss, and the quiet strength that music had always given him. This wasn't just a performance. It was Caleb pouring his heart into every note. The students who had expected him to fail now sat frozen in place. Madison, who rarely showed emotion, leaned forward in her seat, her eyes wide with disbelief. Even Ethan, still slouched in his chair, no longer wore his arrogant smirk. His expression was blank, uncertain, as though he was trying to understand how this could possibly be happening. Miss Roberts stood near the blackboard, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. But her smug grin had vanished. In its place was something else, something closer to unease. Caleb shifted into the climax of the piece, his fingers racing up and down the keys. The melody rising higher, faster, until the notes seemed to fill every corner of the room. And then, with one final, resounding chord, Caleb stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence, deep and endless. Then, a single clap. From the back of the room, Tyler, Caleb's only real friend, brought his hands together. Another clap followed. And then another. Before Caleb could even look up, the room erupted in applause. "Miss Roberts cleared her throat sharply. "All right," she said, her voice tight. "That's enough. Let's get back to the lesson." But the applause didn't stop. For the first time, Caleb felt something shift. Something bigger than just a performance. He'd walked into that classroom expecting to be humiliated. Instead, he'd walked out of the shadow they'd kept him in for so long. He wasn't invisible anymore. As Caleb returned to his seat, Ethan glared at him from across the room. "You just got lucky," he muttered under his breath. Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because for once, the truth was loud enough for everyone to hear. The room was still buzzing. The lingering echoes of applause clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Thick, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Caleb Monroe sat back at his desk, his fingers still tingling from the performance. His pulse throbbed in his ears, but beneath it was something else. A quiet sense of victory. For once, he wasn't invisible. But the moment of triumph didn't last long. "That was interesting," Miss Roberts said, her voice clipped and strained. She stood stiffly at the front of the room, clearly scrambling to regain control. Now, let's move on to today's lesson. The applause faltered. Some students hesitated, unsure whether to keep clapping or follow Miss Roberts's lead. Slowly, the noise died down. Caleb could feel the shift in the air. Miss Roberts wasn't about to let this go. Well, she added with an exaggerated smile, I suppose anyone can memorize a song with enough practice. There it was, her attempt to downplay what had just happened. Some students chuckled nervously, more out of habit than conviction. Ethan Parker, slouched near the back, snorted. Yeah, Ethan muttered. Probably just got lucky. Caleb didn't flinch. He knew they were desperate to undermine him, to twist what had happened into something less than what it was. But it didn't matter, because Caleb had more. You know, Caleb said suddenly, his voice cutting through the murmurs, I could play another piece, if you'd like. The room froze. Miss Roberts's smile tightened. That won't be necessary, she said quickly. But it was too late. Oh, come on, Ethan called out, his smirk widening. Let's see what else you've got. Monroe. More whispers rippled across the room. Some students looked eager, others skeptical, but no one turned away. Caleb stood up. He wasn't sure what had driven him to speak, but now that the words were out, he couldn't stop. He walked back to the piano, ignoring the tension in the air. His fingers hovered above the keys. I don't need sheet music, Caleb said. The challenge was unmistakable. Miss Roberts' face hardened. Fine, she said. Go ahead. Caleb closed his eyes, drawing in a slow breath. His mind flashed back to evenings spent with his grandfather, the old man's voice low and warm, guiding him through melodies that seemed to weave their way into his soul. Music isn't just notes, his grandfather had told him once. It's a voice when words aren't enough. And now, that's exactly what Caleb needed. His fingers pressed down. The first note rang out, clear and rich, filling the air like a heartbeat. This time, Caleb didn't hold back. The melody surged forward, rising and falling in waves. Each chord swelled with emotion, not hesitation, not fear, but strength. He played something new, something raw. It wasn't a song he'd memorized, it was a story. His story. Every note carried the frustration of being ignored, the quiet anger of being underestimated, and the strength he had built from every time he'd been overlooked. The melody shifted from soft and reflective to sharp and powerful, like a voice finally finding the courage to shout. The students who had been whispering before now sat frozen. Madison, the quiet girl who rarely reacted to anything, was leaning forward in her chair, her eyes wide. Even Ethan, the one who had mocked him the most, stared with his mouth slightly open, as if trying to process what he was hearing. But it was Miss Roberts' reaction that mattered most. Her smug smile had vanished. She stood perfectly still, her arms crossed tightly, but her fingers twitched against her elbow, like she was gripping her own arm to keep her frustration in check. Caleb saw it, that flicker of panic behind her cold expression. She knew. She knew that whatever power she thought she had over him was gone. The music swelled, building toward a powerful crescendo. Caleb's fingers danced across the keys with precision, weaving a melody that filled every corner of the room. And then, he stopped. The final chord hung in the air, vibrating like a thunderclap, before fading into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the applause, louder, stronger than before. This wasn't polite clapping. This was real. Students were on their feet now, cheering and hollering. Tyler clapped hard enough that his palms turned red. Even Madison was smiling, a rare and genuine smile. But the most powerful reaction came from Ethan. He didn't clap. He didn't sneer. He just sat there, staring at Caleb like he was seeing him for the first time. Caleb turned back to Miss Roberts. She stood stiffly by her desk, her face pale and tight. Well, she said flatly, that's enough. Sit down. But no one moved. For once, no one was listening to her. Caleb walked back to his seat, heart still racing, and sank into his chair. Tyler turned to him, grinning. Dude, Tyler whispered. You just made her lose it. Caleb smiled, but it wasn't pride that filled him, it was relief. Because he hadn't played to humiliate anyone. He'd played to be heard. And for the first time, they had listened. The classroom was still humming with tension. Even after the applause faded and students began settling back into their seats, the atmosphere refused to return to normal. Caleb could feel it. An uneasy energy hanging in the air like static before a storm. "Mr. Roberts stood at the front of the room, her jaw tight, her fingers drumming on her desk. She wasn't just frustrated, she was furious. The performance hadn't just surprised her, it had completely undermined her plan. The trap she had set for Caleb had backfired spectacularly. But Caleb knew this wasn't over. "Well," Miss Roberts said finally, her voice sharp as glass. "That was unexpected." She forced a thin smile, but her eyes stayed cold. "But let's not forget, this is a classroom, not a concert hall." A few students chuckled awkwardly, but no one laughed outright. The room wasn't on her side anymore, not like before. "You proved you can play a piano," Miss Roberts added, her voice tightening. "But that doesn't change the fact that academics come first." Caleb stayed silent. He knew what she was trying to do: diminish what had just happened, act as though his performance was nothing more than a brief distraction. But no one was buying it. "You told him to play," Tyler said from his desk. His voice wasn't loud, but the words cut through the room like a blade. "And he played better than anyone expected." The room shifted. A few students murmured in agreement. Caleb glanced around, seeing heads nodding, some hesitant, some certain. For the first time, people were starting to question the narrative Miss Roberts had built around him. "You can't seriously believe," Miss Roberts began, but another voice cut her off. "It's true," Madison chimed in. Normally quiet and reserved, her voice now carried unexpected strength. "You wanted him to fail. You thought he couldn't do it." More whispers. Caleb felt the tension rising, each murmur building like water behind a dam. "Enough," Miss Roberts snapped, slamming her palm on her desk. The room went still. "I am your teacher," she said slowly, her voice trembling with anger. "I set the expectations in this classroom. And if you think that one little performance changes everything, you're wrong." Her gaze locked on Caleb, sharp and cold. "You're not special," she spat. "You're just a boy who got lucky." The words hit like a punch. Caleb's face burned, but he kept his expression calm. He wasn't going to let her see him flinch. "Lucky?" Tyler said incredulously. "That's what you're calling it?" "Yeah," Ethan added suddenly. Caleb's eyes widened in surprise. Ethan had always been one of his biggest tormentors. But now, Ethan's voice was low and uncertain. "That wasn't luck. That was talent," Madison finished. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "And you can't stand that you were wrong." Miss Roberts' face twisted into something between anger and disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something, anything to regain control, but nothing came out. For the first time, she seemed unsure of what to do. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, she grabbed her grade book and slammed it shut. "Everyone open your textbooks," she barked. "Page 213. We're moving on." Slowly, students shuffled their books open, but no one was focused on the pages. Caleb could feel the stares, some lingering, some brief, but no one was looking at him the same way they used to. He wasn't invisible anymore. Later that day, word spread quickly. By lunchtime, Caleb's performance was all anyone could talk about. Whispers trailed him wherever he went. Some students offered shy smiles as he passed. Others whispered behind their hands, sneaking quick glances in his direction. But not everyone was impressed. "Big deal," Ethan muttered loudly from across the cafeteria, so he played a song. "Doesn't mean he's special." Caleb pretended not to hear, but Tyler wasn't having it. "Why don't you try doing what he did?" Tyler shot back. "I could," Ethan sneered. "If I wanted to waste my time." "You don't get it," Madison cut in, joining the conversation unexpectedly. "He didn't just play, he proved he belongs here." Ethan scoffed, but for once, he didn't have much to say. By the end of the week, the tension between Caleb and Miss Roberts simmered just beneath the surface. She stopped calling on him in class, clearly hoping to erase him from her mind. But that strategy didn't work. The students had seen too much. They had witnessed something powerful, something undeniable. But Caleb knew Miss Roberts wasn't finished. On Friday afternoon, as the last bell rang, Caleb packed his things slowly, feeling the familiar unease creeping in. Miss Roberts lingered at her desk, watching him with that same calculating stare. "Caleb," she called out as the other students filed out the door. He paused, his backpack half-zipped. "I know what you think you've accomplished," she said coldly. "But don't let it go to your head. One performance doesn't make you special. You'll slip up, and when you do, I'll be there." Caleb met her gaze. He knew what this was. A threat, plain and simple. "I'm not trying to be special," Caleb said quietly. "I just wanted you to know I'm here." He turned and walked out the door, feeling her eyes on him the whole way. That night, as Caleb sat at his grandfather's old piano, his fingers gliding softly across the keys, he realized something. He didn't need Miss Roberts to believe in him. He didn't need everyone's approval. He just needed to know that the next time they tried to silence him, his music would speak louder than their words. For the first time in what felt like forever, Caleb walked through the halls of Jefferson Middle School without feeling invisible. The whispers that had followed him earlier in the week had started to die down, but the way people looked at him, that had changed permanently. They didn't see a shadow anymore, they saw him. Even the students who once ignored him now acknowledged him in subtle ways. A quick nod, a brief smile, or even just a second glance when he walked past. They didn't always say much, but that was okay. Caleb didn't need their words, he had already said everything he needed to say with his music. But Miss Roberts? That was a different story. She had kept her distance ever since his performance. No smug smiles. No snide remarks. No cold glares. Instead, she avoided looking at him altogether. But Caleb knew better than to think that meant she had accepted what happened. He could feel it. The tension still lingered like a storm cloud waiting to break. And sure enough, it did. Friday afternoon. Last period, Miss Roberts stood at the front of the room, her voice clipped and icy as she lectured. Her words felt rushed, forced, like she was trying to push the class forward without leaving room for questions or discussion. Caleb kept his head down, quietly taking notes, but he knew what was coming. "Caleb," Miss Roberts said suddenly, her tone sharp. His hand froze mid-sentence. Slowly, he looked up. "Would you mind explaining the Treaty of Versailles to the class?" she asked, her smile thin and pointed. Caleb knew what this was. Another test, this time, not with music, but with facts. She wanted him to stumble, to flinch, to give her something, anything, that she could twist into a reason to dismiss him. But Caleb had prepared for this. He set his pencil down and met her gaze directly. "The Treaty of Versailles," he began, "was signed in 1919 to formally end World War I. It imposed strict reparations on Germany, reduced its military, and forced them to accept full responsibility for the war. Many historians believe this treaty contributed to the economic hardship that later fueled the rise of Nazi Germany." The room was silent. Caleb's voice had been clear, steady, and confident. Not a hint of hesitation. Miss Roberts' smile twitched. "That's acceptable," she muttered, turning back toward the board. But her voice was weaker than before, like someone who had just lost another round of a game they didn't know how to win. After class, as Caleb packed up his things, Miss Roberts lingered at her desk once again. This time, she didn't bother calling him back. But Caleb knew she wanted to. He paused at the door, watching her out of the corner of his eye. "You know," she said finally, without looking at him. "You think you've proven something here." Caleb turned fully toward her. "I didn't do it to prove anything," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to see me." Miss Roberts scoffed under her breath, shaking her head. "Don't get too comfortable," she warned. "People like you always end up disappointing themselves." Those words stung, but Caleb refused to let her see it. "Maybe," he said. "But I know one thing, you'll remember me." He didn't wait for her reply. He simply turned and walked out the door. The following week, on Monday morning, Caleb walked into the cafeteria expecting things to return to normal, whatever normal meant now. But instead, something surprising happened. Brandon, the arrogant kid who had mocked him most, was sitting near the back of the cafeteria with his usual group of friends. But when Caleb passed by, Brandon didn't sneer or whisper something cruel. Instead, he gave a subtle nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Caleb paused for just a second, then nodded back. Moments later, Madison appeared beside him, balancing her lunch tray with one hand. "Told you things would change," she said with a smile. Caleb chuckled softly. "I didn't expect it to happen this fast." "People don't forget moments like that," Madison replied. They were waiting for you to fail. But instead, you gave them something they couldn't ignore. They sat down at their table, joined by Tyler and a few others who had slowly drifted into Caleb's circle. These weren't just sympathy friends, they were people who had started to see him for who he really was. "Are you gonna keep playing?" Tyler asked between bites of his sandwich. "You know, for the school talent show?" Caleb grinned. "I might," he said, but his voice was teasing. "Oh, you better," Madison laughed. "I'll be there cheering." For the first time in a long time, Caleb felt light, like the weight of invisibility had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Later that evening, Caleb sat at his grandfather's old piano, his fingers gliding across the keys once again. This time, the melody wasn't one of tension or pressure, it was soft, warm, familiar. The music wasn't a weapon anymore, it was his voice. A voice no one could silence. And as he played, Caleb knew that no matter what happened next, no matter what Miss Roberts tried, or what challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't be invisible again. Because the truth had been spoken. And no one could unhear it. The story of Caleb is more than just a tale of a student proving himself. It's a powerful reminder of resilience, self-belief, and the courage to stand firm when others doubt you. One of the most significant lessons lies in the way Caleb handled adversity. Instead of reacting with anger or bitterness, when faced with prejudice and low expectations, he let his actions, and more importantly, his talents, speak for themselves. This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest strength comes from quiet determination. Caleb didn't seek validation or approval, he focused on being the best version of himself, trusting that the truth would eventually shine through. His story encourages us to stay true to who we are, even when the world tries to push us into the shadows. For older audiences, this lesson holds special meaning. Life's challenges may have taught us that change is slow, and fairness doesn't always come easily. But like Caleb, we can leave lasting impressions by holding firm in our values, using our strengths to prove that dignity, talent, and perseverance can overcome even the most stubborn prejudices. In the end, the truth cannot be ignored, and those who doubted you will remember your strength long after the moment has passed. Caleb's journey is a testament to the power of resilience and self-belief. No matter how invisible you may feel, your voice, your talent, and your truth can break through. If this story inspired you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories about courage, determination, and the strength to rise above adversity. He was the quiet kid no one noticed, overlooked by teachers, ignored by classmates, and treated as if he didn't exist. But when his history teacher set a trap designed to humiliate him, they had no idea what they were about to witness. With nothing but an old, dusty piano and a memory filled with lessons from his grandfather, this invisible student delivered a performance that left an entire room speechless. What happened next would change the way everyone saw him, and force his teacher to face a truth she had tried to deny. You won't believe how this story ends. Click now to watch the full journey unfold.